What's up, everybody? We have another fun video today, just a random, just thought-provoking series of questions, which will then get to a bigger point I have. So a couple days ago, I asked and said one of my favorite interview questions I was ever asked, and I think this was by D.E. Shaw. I can't really remember. Can an equity trade for a negative amount? If yes, why? If no, why not? And so I think for both of these questions, there's not necessarily a right answer. I think the more important thing here that I think any interview person is looking for is how does this person logic this out? What points are the candidate touching on? And so I think back at the time, my answer to can an equity trade for a negative amount was yes. And interestingly enough, I think now fast forward, 15 years later, I think I would actually argue yes on this one. So why is that? Why do I think it's yes? So a couple things that I would use to support my case. So a lot of people mentioned the WTI oil incident back from COVID, and that was the case where oil futures went negative. The difference with oil futures, of course, is that they are settled physically. Part of why oil went negative was because if you're taking settlement of that in Cushing, Oklahoma, and there's such a huge oil glut, you are in trouble. A lot of people were not meant to be taking physical settlement. And essentially, for physical settlement, you need storage. There's transportation costs, there's storage costs. So at face value, we had never, ever seen a future settle negative. But that day, the CME announced, yes, it is possible for these contracts to go negative because largely, I think they're aware of the costs of taking settlement involved. So if you need to offload that contract, it might be for a negative price on a storage glut like that. So that being said, equities are not futures contracts. There is no physical settlement of a product per se. So why do I still think the possibility is yes? So first of all, I really think at face value, like the answer should be no. But the issue is so many weird things happen in financial markets. And the truth is we haven't had modern equity markets all that long of a time in the grand scheme of just humanity. And the weird things that will happen in the future are inevitable, right? Just any low probability thing over a long enough time horizon becomes an inevitability. And I think the bigger point I would make is there are times where I could think of exceptions. So here are some thoughts where my head goes to now and where it also went to back then. I think even when I was interviewing, the point I raised was, yeah, in theory, equity holders don't take on liability for the company. But what if something just egregiously bad happened? Like, what if a company did something so heinous or so destructive where a court were to rule that there was potential liability there, even for equity holders, whether through knowledge or just for providing capital to an entity that was doing something so heinous. Maybe some type of pollution, maybe some type of cover-up. The truth is we don't know. We've not actually seen this. But if an equity did face the ruling that okay, a judge is going to be deciding are equity holders responsible for additional costs, you could foresee that equity become a liability and a risk, and you could see reasonably firms want to offload that open-ended risk and trade around a negative equity value. The other point that came to my mind that I think is an interesting one is, let's say you're short something. Take like a Chinese fraud bullshit thing, take some OTC bullshit thing, but take something with a cost of borrow, a margin cost, right? So generally if you're shorting anything, that's settled on margin. And you could see the situation where a Chinese stock gets halted and someone is stuck paying margin for that, margin and borrow on that short. So if something has a regulatory halt, and for whatever reason something's going to be regulatory halted for like 2 years, if you're paying, I don't know, a 70% annualized borrow rate, and you are potentially risking holding this for multiple years, maybe there is something where if somebody, I don't know, someone wants to just offset that. I don't know. It's a weird situation like that where could that then, just to incentivize someone to offload that? I don't know. Like, and likewise for being long, like, well, I guess that would potentially drive the price up. I don't know. But I guess even if you're long, you're still paying, say you're long on leverage and you're paying margin. That's one thought. Or the other thought I had too was like, what if somebody just really needs something off their books because of a mandate? Like say you're a hedge fund, or you're a mutual fund, or you're an ETF, and you need something halted off your books because reg halt halted, downgraded to OTC or something, but like you're not supposed to hold it and you're just stuck without a trading market. It does make you think, like, could you need to pay someone? The other thing too, I wonder if someone might do some type of just like off exchange tax arbitrage, where let's say somebody is long a stock that's a zero, but they need to realize the loss. But how do you get someone else to put just a zero on their books? I don't know. You could see something weird where for whatever reason someone needs to pay money to get it off their books, get it off margin. And so even a bankrupt company, it might eventually be worth zero. But if you're holding it at a price and paying margin, I guess that's my point there. But the biggest thing I would also say is you do want a level of doubt most times with markets, because weird things happen. So that was an interesting question. Then the other question I posed was, a candidate arrives for an interview 15 minutes late, proffering no excuse or apology. So as a result, you overlooked the candidate and kind of wrote him off, only to later find out that they were told the wrong time. So conceptually, what happened, and did you make a bad decision? So there were some decent answers here, but to my surprise, no one really actually touched on the concepts. And that's going to lead to my point 3 that I'm going to make later. So the concept that I think is really at the core of this is there's times where you make a decision off of a pretty reasonable assumption, an assumption that you had for logical reasons, and an assumption that's actually often quite helpful, but it turned out to be the wrong assumption. So what this really comes down to is, in layman, I guess not even layman, but what this is this is a heuristic, or a bias, essentially. A heuristic is a decision you make based on a limited amount of information that allows you to make a decision that is right most of the time, not all of the time. And for those that are part of the Magnum Opus course, I have my favorite heuristics laid out in videos. That doesn't mean the heuristic gets you the optimal response every single time on a case-by-case basis, but in the aggregate, they're really, really good rules of thumb. And so what happened here is the interviewer, one of his heuristics is you got to be on time for your interview. And I think that's very reasonable. It just so happens that in this specific instance, it led to the wrong decision. But did you make a bad decision? I would argue that even though you might have made, on that individual case, a wrong decision and dismissed him early, it wasn't a bad decision. That heuristic exists for a reason. It's if you're interviewing 3,000 candidates or 300 candidates, and looking at, I mean, this even came up when I was interviewing candidates for all the years for Trillium. You get a crazy stack of resumes, you get a crazy stack of people you gotta interview, and you really do rely on a lot of biases to make the right decision, because you need to streamline the process somehow. That's just like many firms will say you need a 3.0 GPA or greater. Well, guess what? It might be very easy to get a 3.0 or greater in business school, and it's quite hard in more of the STEM majors like engineering, physics, whatever. To get a 3.0 or higher at MIT is way different in engineering than getting a 3.0 from your average business school, which has grade inflation. Yet that rule exists to help streamline the filtering process, which otherwise would be just overly cumbersome. You can't do that otherwise. So heuristics exist for a lot of good reasons. And so one person said, you're an artard for making a decision based off of a false premise. And I pushed back on this. So there's tons of times you can make a decision off of false premise, but here's what it really comes down to. If we really break down this concept, is the cost of a bad decision at an individual level, is that cost higher than making a quicker, roughly accurate decision at the aggregate level? So let's take this for example. Let's say I'm going back 1,000 years and I know that some mushrooms are poisonous. As a result of some mushrooms being poisonous, I make a just totally broad decision and I say I am never going to eat a mushroom. Which means, okay, I might miss out on the occasional, shiitake mushroom, portobello mushroom, but overall, I'm making that bias, and I have that bias because there are times where it might kill me. And I don't care if I miss out on shiitake mushrooms because I don't want to die if I'm just a forager. So all these biases exist for really good reasons, and it does not mean you made a bad decision. And a lot of what this gets down to is kind of just behavioral psychology. Why do humans make the decisions they do? Does this lead to inefficiencies? Does this lead to opportunities? And so both of these questions, I think, are pretty thought-provoking. I don't think there's necessarily a right answer. I think you can argue both sides for any of this, but that's the way I thought of this. And I now want to kind of bring up and proffer the third point, which is most people responding to these, not even just on Twitter, but I think if you were to take the average human would struggle really, really hard with these questions. Some might not even know what an equity is. Some might not really have ever thought about heuristics, biases, some of these decisions. And I guess lately I've really been going down the rabbit hole on AI. And I am drinking the Kool-Aid, I must confess. And what's so interesting to me is if I look at a lot of the people that I find intellectually interesting and intellectual role models, I've been following Sam Altman of Y Combinator for a very long time. I was following Brian Johnson for a long time. I was following Dr. Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization. And so all of these three people have very distinct backgrounds, right? We have a startup guy, we have a tech internet payment mogul, and we have an exercise scientist. And what's so interesting is all three of these people have converged around AI and saying like, oh my God, like this is the stuff that really matters. Like everything else out there is going to just become irrelevant to these questions. And the more I think about AI and the rate of change of AI, the more I'm also kind of joining that and just thinking like, oh my God, the only thing I should really be thinking about is AI. And the reason why I asked both these questions to begin with was I was curious, like, are we already at the point where AI gives me better answers than humans? And if you took, I don't think anybody gave a better answer to either question than what I get from AI in just kind of, 1 minute of pretty minimal prodding. And I don't think people have realized that AI is pretty much surpassed. First of all, I would assume most of the people reading my questions are above average intelligence and have above average business knowledge. But I would argue at this point, even though it's not commonly accepted, AI and ChatGPT is just so far beyond the average human intelligence now. Not only does it have access to so much knowledge, but I was doing a health appointment with my good buddy, Dr. Daniel Keeley. And as he was giving me advice and talking to me about stuff, I had ChatGPT open and I was just plugging it with a lot of the same questions. And a lot of the answers were exceptionally good. And these are for really niche questions on microbiome. These are for questions on supplementation. These are questions on blood work implementation. So if you take someone like Dr. Kile, where his hourly rate is very, very, very high, then you take not just where AI is, but where AI is going, it's insane that someone can have access to this level of intelligence. And most importantly, like it's so without beyond a benefit of a doubt that in 3 to 5 years, this AI is going to just absolutely dwarf us intellectually. And most people just haven't thought about what these repercussions are, right? Like we think about so much of nest egg, savings, health, strategy, game planning. I'm going to buy a home in 10 years. I'm going to be a day trader for another 20 years. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. But I don't think many people are realizing how much the world, at least to me, is on path for just crazy seismic change. Not that I know how actionable that is. I don't really know how to position myself or what the implications will be. But it's kind of interesting. Like ask ChatGPT these questions. Ask GPT some really hard interview questions, very subjective, creative questions, and you're going to be surprised by the answers. When I prompted ChatGPT to address the equity trading for a negative amount, some of its answers were far more intelligent than I am going to get from the average interview candidate. Even if I take candidates from good schools, the answers were great. So yeah, this was kind of my litmus test to just see, like, I don't know, how do humans and just online responses stack up against AI? So there you go. Those are my thoughts on the questions. Those are my thoughts on AI. And if you want to kind of dip your toe into some of this, Dr. Mike Israetel, who has an epic YouTube following for exercise science, he also has a personal channel that touches on a lot of AI. And I find that stuff really fascinating just because I think he's a good thinker. So anywho, thank you for listening to this random subject. And I hope you all had a great weekend. We have a big week ahead. So everyone rest up and stay sane.